There is a lead weight in the nautical cabinet that no one ever admires on purpose. It is a squat, dull thing, palm-sized and unlovely, dark with age and salt. The sort of object a noble collector might overlook while lunging instead for a captain's astrolabe or a gilt compass box or some handsome chart whose coastlines flatter the owner's sense of adventure. This one has no such vanity. Its surface is scarred. The eye at the top is worn thin by rope. At the bottom there remains still the shallow hollow where tallow was once pressed, so that when the weight kissed the seabed, it would bring back a little testimony. Sand, shell grit, black mud, fragments of weed, whatever the hidden flaw wished to confess to careful hands. A sounding lead, a humble instrument, and therefore a trustworthy one. Its task was never to promise mastery of the sea. Only this much: tell me what lies beneath my ship, where I may pass, where I will run aground, how near the harbour mouth may be, whether the bottom is sand enough for anchorage or treacherous enough to drag a hull broadside in foul weather. Practical questions, mortal questions, questions asked not by conquerors in murals, but by pilots, smugglers, naval lieutenants, merchant captains, pearl divers, temple couriers, and anxious young officers trying to look older than their fear. I have always liked tools that admit what they cannot do. A sounding lead cannot still a storm. It cannot bribe a pirate, flatter a harbour master, silence a mutiny, appease Umberly, or persuade a kingdom that its customs duties are anything but elegant extortion. It cannot warn you that the ship beside you flies a friendly banner only until moonrise. It cannot tell whether the grain in your hold will reach a starving city in time, or whether the letter in your chest will end a war or begin one. But it can say, here the bottom rises. Here the hidden world nears the keel. Here your calculations must change. That, my apprentice, is as fine a definition of history as any ever scratched into vellum. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Belnorn Law Warden, auditor of shipping manifests. No one expected to survive 3 dynasties and 2 warehouse fires, registrar of storms that were blamed on gods, and gods that were blamed on storms, and patient enemy of every mapmaker who paints inland seas as blank blue interruptions between the places he actually cares to discuss. This is the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. We remain in our 2nd season, Realms Between Ruins, the Long Age of Kingdoms. In the 1st season, we crossed the larger sweep of Faerûn entire, the contradictory first stories, the creator races and their world-shaping arrogance, the cataclysms that left the world palimpsested rather than pristine, the elder ages of dragons and giants, the great flowering of the elven realms, the crown wars and their enduring wounds, the founding time, the rise of dwarven and human powers, the impossible brilliance of Netheril and its unforgivable collapse, Myth Drana's noble gamble, the long life of factions that learn to outlast kings, the time of troubles, the spell plague, and the stern breathing space of the Second Sundering. Then, as this season opened, we asked a subtler question and a more dangerous one. Not simply what happened, but who inherited what remained, who found roads already laid, wards already failing, forests already claimed, harbours already silted, shrines already holy, grudges already waiting. Who built upon the bones, who scavenged them, who mistook second occupation for first right. We began by refusing the childish fantasy of empty land. Faerûn, we said, is not wilderness awaiting meaning. It is an overwritten manuscript in which every kingdom arrives late. Jamdath then taught us that human greatness in the realms was not always arcane spectacle, for some empires built power from disciplined mind rather than floating stone. Mulhorand and Unther showed us what happens when divinity ceases to be abstraction and becomes administration, taxation, labor order, rank and law. Chesenta and Chondath revealed the Vilhon Reach as political furnace, where city-states, mercantile appetite and martial ambition learn to wear one another's clothing. Kalimshan reminded us that some civilizations are genuinely old and know it in their bones. Shun taught the afterlife of empire, when institutions forget how not to expand. Amn and Tether offered adjacent failures of legitimacy, one ruled too much by wealth, the other too little by wisdom. Chult corrected the northern vice of mistaking unfamiliar centers for picturesque margins. The north itself we studied before later legend made it seem inevitable, and found culture hammered from danger rather than merely ornamented by it. Cormyr gave us disciplined monarchy, where institutions survived rulers. The Dale lands and Sembia showed local freedom and merchant appetite, living in permanent, uneasy proximity. The Moonsea proved that some frontiers choose cruelty knowingly. Rashamen refused imperial measures of power. They reminded us that organized evil is often more frightening than theatrical evil. And last time, in Aglarond, we studied a realm whose central political act was refusal. No to conquest, no to simplification, no to absorption, no to the convenient categories in which hungrier neighbors prefer to file their prey. A border bar above a door, a small realm deciding what shall not be admitted. Tonight we take that same lesson and cast it upon water. For the Sea of Fallen Stars, the inner sea, is often treated by lazy chroniclers as though it was scenery. A handsome wash of blue across the middle of the map. A convenient place for ship icons. A broad, wet interruption between the real subjects. Cormyr, Sembia, the Dragon Coast, Termish, the Vilahon, Chesenta, Aglarond, Thay, Mulhorand, Unther, and all the hungry coastlines besides. This is wrong. The Sea of Fallen Stars is not interruption. It is acceleration. It is not background. It is bloodstream. Whatever enters it goes elsewhere. Grain, wine, iron, timber, jade, coral, incense, slaves, mercenaries, pilgrims, relics, plague, ambassadors, fugitives, spies, marriage contracts, naval doctrine, dockside superstitions, temple liturgies, forged letters of credit, reputable merchants, disreputable merchants, and those charming in-between creatures who insist the distinction is mostly one of bookkeeping. Some landscapes slow history. This one hastens it. That is our subject. Not merely the coastlines themselves, though we shall travel them. Not merely pirates, though we shall certainly make room for those parasites and entrepreneurs. Not merely navies, tariffs, temples, or merchant houses, though none of these may be omitted. Our question tonight is larger. Why do inland seas make history faster? What happens to kingdoms when water can move goods more cheaply than roads, rumors more quickly than councils, and armies more efficiently than apologies? How does a sea teach city-states to become predators, monarchies to become administrators, merchant powers to become shadow empires, and temples to learn the value of harbor chapels? Why do peoples who never themselves smell brine, still feel the tides in the price of grain and the arrival of alarming news. And, because I'm old enough to prefer troublesome truths to pretty simplifications, we must also ask what it means that this great road of commerce was never empty. The surface folk sailed above other sovereignties, other wars, other gods, other markets. Beneath the hulls lay Siroz, the undersea realms of the inner sea, where aquatic elves, merfolk, Sahuagin, dragon turtles, and stranger peoples conducted their own histories with only intermittent regard for the anxieties of dry-footed customs clerks. Yes, you see the problem already. A kingdom may tell itself the sea is a highway. The sea itself seldom agrees. But before we follow the coasts and sound the channels, a word from the sponsor who keeps our own archival infrastructure from becoming a cautionary tale told in mildew. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need web design and development built for clarity, durability, long maintenance, and the unglamorous precision by which large systems survive the traffic they invite, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. Good harbors, like good websites, are not judged by how elegant they appear on a fine day when nothing has gone wrong. They are judged by what happens when demand surges, tempers fray, rules conflict, unexpected users arrive from directions the original planner failed to imagine, and the whole structure must keep functioning while everyone insists his cargo is the urgent one. Choose builders who understand load, flow, revision, and the quiet heroism of infrastructure. Now then, let us begin with the most basic discourtesy the sea of fallen stars offers to careless thought. It refuses to behave like an edge. An outer sea may give a people the luxury of imagining one dominant direction. Inland from the coast lies the kingdom. Out to sea lies peril, trade, foreignness, perhaps opportunity if one is feeling energetic. The sea of fallen stars affords no such simplicity. It is enclosed enough to bind many coasts into a single conversation, vast enough that the conversation never becomes polite, and central enough that powers who would prefer local concerns are constantly forced to reckon with distant disturbances. In the west lie the Dragonmere and the Lake of Dragons, where Cormyr learned that a monarchy with maritime access must think in fleets, customs, and convoy rather than forests alone. Along the northern waters, the Dragon Reach and Easting Reach put Sembian merchants, Dragon Coast opportunists, eastern ports, and inland-connected markets into repeated contact, whether they liked it or not. In the east, the Alamba Sea made ambiguity profitable and dangerous by setting Thai, Mulhorand, Unther, Aglarond's sphere, and neighboring waters into uneasy relation. To the south, the Vilhon Reach linked the city-state world we have already studied to the larger basin, ensuring that Chesenta, Chondath, Turmish, and the heirs of older empires could never pretend their rivalries were purely local matters. And because the gods occasionally enjoy reminding mortals that geography itself has a sense of memory, the Sea of Fallen Stars was no accidental puddle. One old tale claimed its name came from a star hurled down in punishment for the arrogance of giants, a myth not entirely devoid of tone even where it fails in chronology. The deeper account binds its making to the ancient catastrophe of the Tearfall, when the primordial Asgarath, the world shaper, hurled an ice moon down upon Toril in the final convulsions of the days of thunder, wiping out the Batrashi and helping form the great Central Sea. I mention this not because tonight is a lecture on prehistory. We have already given those shelves their due. I mention it because the realms is full of places whose utility tempts later peoples to forget their violence. A ship captain cares that the water is there. History cares how it came to be there. These are not the same question. Even later, the naming of the sea remained wrapped in stories of punishment, collapse, fire, and pride. Very well. Let us grant the old storytellers their instinct. They understood something the accountants always resist. A great inland sea is never merely a convenience. It is an arrangement with catastrophe. Perhaps that is why it so often breeds states of unusual nervous energy. Think of what such a sea does to distance. Overland bulk transport in Faerûn is costly, slow, seasonal, vulnerable, and rude to the spine. Roads matter profoundly, and we have spent enough time in this season among roads to avoid the merchant's vulgar temptation to reduce civilization to shipping alone. Yet water carries heavy cargo more efficiently than wagon trains. A single vessel can move what would require lines of carts, drovers, guards, wheelwrights, teamsters and prayers if sent inland. Grain, timber, stone, oil, metal ingots, amphorae of wine, bales of cloth, quarried blocks, even livestock under sufficiently objectionable conditions. All these obey different economic laws once a sea lane becomes dependable enough to plan around. Dependable enough. Not safe, never safe. Only dependable enough that people continue using it despite the dangers. There is a difference. The distinction matters. Mortal societies do not wait for certainty before building institutions. They build when repeated risk begins to look manageable by method. Once the sea of fallen stars became not merely a body of water, but a repeated route. Then harbors needed dredging, pilots needed training, lighthouses and beacons needed tending, tariffs needed codifying. Maritime insurance, whether formalized in ledgers or diffused through kinship, temple guarantees, and merchant partnerships, needed inventing, and every coastal power discovered that shipyards, rope walks, chandlers, sailmakers, coopers, carters, key wardens, translators, brokers, moneylenders, and harbor priests were no longer picturesque accessories. They were organs. A port is what happens when a shoreline admits that paperwork can be tidal. And because paperwork attracts power, the way lantern light attracts insects and opportunists, a port also becomes a school in state formation. Here a king learns that sovereignty requires custom schedules, pilotage fees, quarantine orders, dock inspections, naval stores, and the right to ask unpleasant questions about cargoes whose owners had hoped to remain metaphorical. Here a merchant oligarchy learns that coin may command hulls, and that hulls in sufficient number begin to resemble policy. Here, a city-state discovers that walls alone are inadequate. One must also police approaches, negotiate anchorage, patrol reefs, license warehouses, and decide whether smugglers are an existential threat, a manageable inconvenience, or unofficial partners in regional strategy. Here, a temple realizes that chapels beside the quay gather a different sort of devotion than mountain sanctuaries do. For a sailor will promise almost anything in sight of a storm front and dispute the bill only once safely docked. The Sea of Fallen Stars, then, does not simply connect established powers. It teaches them what kind of powers they are. Cormyr offers one lesson. Sembia offers another. Westgate, being Westgate, offers several contradictory lessons at once and sells each of them by the hour. Let us begin in the west, where the waters narrow toward the Dragonmere, and the great forest kingdom must decide whether monarchy can learn to smell of tar, wet rope, and herring without losing dignity. Cormyr, as we discussed in its own episode, endured not because royalty is romantic, but because institutions were forced into sturdier form than the vanity of individual rulers. At sea, this truth becomes especially visible. A king may declare himself lord of coast and bay. The water responds by asking whether his officials can measure tonnage, maintain warships, signal storms, inspect manifests, protect merchants from raiders, and still keep enough credibility that traders prefer his ports to the next man's. This is why maritime administration is such a ruthless examiner of political fantasies. Poetic kingship may inspire a banner. It does not caulk hull seams. Cormyr's access through Suzail and Marsember placed the realm into the inner sea's circulating life, whether the court wished simplicity or not. Goods entering those harbours were not merely luxury. They were leverage, tax base, strategic necessity, and intelligence source. Sailors arrive with news. Captains arrive with rumours disguised as invoices. Dock workers overhear more policy than ambassadors. A disciplined monarchy that neglects its ports soon discovers that other people are governing the realm's economic future on its behalf. Now set Sembia beside that and observe the difference in temperament. Where Cormyr approached the sea as a kingdom learning maritime governance, Sembia approached it as commerce approaching destiny, with ledgers sharpened to a fine edge. If Cormyr asked how royal authority might survive contact with shipping, Sembia asked how shipping might become authority. Its merchant houses, factors, fleets, sailors, corsairs, port investments, credit networks, and appetite for opportunity turned the northern and western reaches of the inner sea into something more than routes. They became circulating capital. That is an ugly phrase, I know, but accurate, and accuracy must sometimes endure ugliness. Money afloat is not passive wealth. It is ambition in motion. A realm like Sembia does not merely trade across a sea. It studies where prices are thin, where law is weak, where local elites are buyable, where harbour privileges may be purchased, where customs may be evaded, where a rival's shortage can be made profitable, where grain can arrive just late enough to raise margins without quite provoking a riot, and where the distinction between merchant marine, defensive escort, and private predation may be kept pleasantly ambiguous. No wonder Sembian sailors and corsairs became such a force in the western reaches. A merchant culture that counts only coin will eventually discover ships. A merchant culture that counts ships seriously will begin, despite itself, to count power. Do not mistake me. There is nothing uniquely wicked in this. The sea invites it from everyone. Sembia is simply franker about the invitation. Then there is the Dragon Coast and Westgate, that city whose reputation arrives several days before the harbour itself. Ah, Westgate. Every inland sea requires at least one port where respectable commerce and disreputable commerce share a wall so thin the rats pass commentary through it. Westgate thrived because the inner sea does not reward innocence. Goods move where buyers exist. Buyers exist where law can be negotiated. Law becomes negotiable wherever political forms are oligarchic enough to appreciate revenue and cynical enough to call it pragmatism. Westgate's significance lies not only in vice, though vice is among its more energetic exports. It lies in translation, sea to road, river to coast, cargo to influence, smuggled goods to laundered respectability, sailors to caravans, foreign cults to local patrons. A place like Westgate becomes powerful not because it is morally exceptional, but because it admits, earlier than its neighbors, that there will always be freight unwilling to travel by daylight and patrons willing to pay for twilight arrangements. Where a monarchy might blush and a temple state might thunder, Westgate tallies fees. That too is maritime political theory in its way. And all along these western shores, one sees how the sea of fallen stars compresses time. A crop failure inland becomes urgent at the docks before the fields have finished, disappointing their owners. Timber cut in one realm may become hull planks in another. A religious controversy in one harbour reaches the next by crew gossip before the formal letter has been sealed with proper wax. A pirate attack near one reach raises insurance or convoy prices elsewhere within the season. A royal marriage reshapes shipping privileges long before the bridal poetry has cooled. The sea makes simultaneity a practical problem. This is why inland seas alter not only commerce, but political imagination. Rulers must begin thinking in chains rather than points. Not what happens in my city, but what happens when my city depends on ships from another coast, on weather from another basin, on pilots who know reefs near a state I dislike, on sailcloth woven under a rival's tariff, on loans secured in a counting house whose patriotism is as portable as its coin chests. The Dale lands themselves, though not literal in the obvious sense, felt these questions through Sembia's maritime reach. It is one of the recurring errors of poor history to treat only shoreline peoples as maritime peoples. Nonsense. The price of iron in a Dale market, the presence of foreign cloth on a merchant's table, the sudden ambition of a local factor, the appearance of a cult imported in a sailor's memory, the new insistence of Sembian buyers on timber rights or river access. These are the sea operating inland through hands that have forgotten the taste of salt by the time they arrive. History travels without always showing its boots, or its deck shoes if you prefer. Continue north and east and the pattern intensifies rather than relaxes. The easting reach and the ports beyond it reveal another characteristic of inland sea civilization: multiplicity of scale. Great powers care for fleets, taxes and embassies. Port cities care for quays, guilds, warehouses, fish markets and tavern fights that inconveniently turn out to have diplomatic consequences. Merchant costers care for predictable timetables and tolerable extortion. Fisherfolk care for weather, shoals, and whether the patrol craft actually respond when raiders are sighted beyond the 10-mile line. Priests care for shrines, alms, ship blessings, funeral rites, and the constant inconvenience that sailors promise offerings to 3 gods at once, and then survive to haggle over which vow counted. Spies care for all of the above. The vast, the eastern ports and the trade-linked coasts toward Impiltur and beyond show this beautifully. A place such as Procampur matters not only because ships can berth there, but because a well-placed port on an inland sea becomes a hinge between maritime and overland spheres. Inland caravans discharge into hulls. Hulls discharge into caravan networks. Families that would never call themselves naval powers nonetheless raise children who think in freight and tide tables. The result is not merely wealth, it is orientation. People begin to imagine the world by routes of transfer rather than by contiguous soil. This is a subtle but immense civilizational change. Many kingdoms conceive themselves first as land. Their laws proceed from fields, villages, roads, castles, forests, and tax districts. Littoral societies, by contrast, often conceive themselves as contact. The city is less a point within a territory than a knot in a network. Its importance depends on what passes through. Its pride depends on who must deal with it. Its politics grow restless because restlessness is profitable. Men who spend their lives among caravans, ships, brokers, agents, dock scribes, and foreign tongues develop a different sense of what the world owes them than peasants bound to a single inland lordship. They are often more pragmatic, less sentimental, quicker to lie about weights and measures, swifter to assess weakness, and harder to impress with hereditary dignity, unsupported by ready coin or credible force. You may hear the criticism in my voice. You hear correctly. Maritime wealth does not automatically ennoble. More often, it sharpens appetite while teaching just enough cosmopolitanism to excuse appetite as sophistication. Yet one must also grant it strengths. Port cultures are adaptable. They learn languages. They improvise. They absorb shocks better than rigid inland polities, at least until the shocks arrive by sea itself. A city accustomed to foreigners, fluctuating supply, and changing prices is less likely to panic at novelty. It may simply invoice it. Impiltur on the eastern reaches teaches a sterner lesson. Not every maritime state requires vast fleets to understand the sea's importance. A hardy, smaller navy, disciplined purpose, and a defensive maritime posture can be enough to make a realm part of the basin's larger balance. Even a handful of reliable warships matters when escort, signal, interception, and prestige are at issue. In inland sea politics, scale is always relative to function. A dozen warships used wisely in defended waters may matter more than a grand fleet neglected by corrupt officers, underpaid crews, and a court that thinks maritime readiness may be postponed until after the next festival. Remember that. It applies to more than ships. By the time we reach the eastern waters and the approaches that brush Aglarond, Thays Sphere, Mulhorand, and Unther, the inner sea's character changes again. In the west, trade and monarchy contend. In the north, merchant appetite, port privilege, and contact cultures dominate. In the east and southeast, shoreline becomes argument made liquid. Borders ashore are already disputed, ceremonial, sacred, or strategic. At sea, they become ambiguous in ways only lawyers and admirals could love. It is no accident that recognized territorial waters matter so much here. Among the nations of the Sea of Fallen Stars, there emerged a broadly accepted limit of 10 miles offshore, beyond which lay neutral waters. Within that zone, attacks upon shipping could be construed as acts of war. Beyond it, deniability grew fat and healthy. Marvelous, is it not, how civilization so often consists of agreeing precisely where hypocrisy becomes actionable. For most coasts, these lines were administratively useful, if never absolute. In the east, where Mulhorand, Unther and Thai carried border disputes, old imperial claims, and incompatible political tempers into adjoining waters, ambiguity became more than an inconvenience. It became strategic habitat. If your frontier is unstable, the sea offers both danger and opportunity. Patrols may overreach, smugglers may thrive, refugees may vanish into harbour districts. Priests, agents, contrabandists, and mercenary recruiters move beneath the cover of maritime routine. A ship's papers look very innocent in a calm harbour. Papers are at their most dangerous precisely when they appear bureaucratic. And that is before one has even mentioned war. War on an inland sea differs from war across open ocean and from war upon land, though it borrows the vices of both. Coasts are close enough that campaigns may unfold in maddening sequence rather than stately separation. A city may blockade, raid, land troops, withdraw, deny intent, sponsor corsairs, reopen trade in one quarter, and escalate in another before inland nobles have even agreed on what the war is called. Ports matter not only as trophies, but as throats. To hold them is to tax passage, shape convoy routes, deny supplies, shelter allies, and spread fear far beyond the actual point of violence. Notice what this does to political tempo. Land wars often allow seasons of preparation visible from afar. Levies called, grain requisitioned, roads repaired, camps raised, smithies set roaring. Maritime conflict can be announced by absence. Ships that do not arrive. Prices that rise unexpectedly. A convoy delayed. A harbour that closes for inspection and somehow never quite reopens to arrival's vessels. A coastal village burned by raiders whose sponsors are known to every fisherman and impossible to prove before the council chamber. Piracy and policy become sisters here, quarrelling in public, sharing a household in private. So let us swing south and consider the Villehon Reach, that remarkable lower basin where old disaster and ongoing ambition were forced into common waters. The Villehon is especially important because it demonstrates that maritime history in Faerûn is rarely separable from magical and environmental catastrophe. We spoke before of Jamdath, the empire of disciplined mind, and of its annihilation. Recall that the region's very shape was altered by the great wave summoned through elven high magic, a devastating retaliation that destroyed both Jamdath and Ariselmalir and remade the basin. Here then, the water is itself an archive of vengeance. The shoreline remembers what politics did to geography. How could such a place possibly become calm afterward? It did not. The Villehon Reach became a basin of successor hungers. Chondath, Chesenta, Turmish, Hlondeth, and lesser powers, merchants, soldiers, temple interests, old ruins, fresh grudges, and opportunistic neighbors all inherited waters whose practical value was matched only by the instability of their surrounding claims. Where earlier we treated the Villehon as political furnace, tonight we see why water stoked the heat. Inland seas and their tributary systems reward urban concentration, shipbuilding, grain movement, fishery, horse trade, and coastal fortification. They also reward suspicion. Every prosperous harbour suspects the next of undercutting tariffs, sheltering smugglers, subsidizing corsairs, poaching pilots, or charming away artisans. These suspicions are usually correct. Chondath is instructive here because it reveals how a people shaped by Jamdathan inheritance and river sea commerce may become expansive without ever quite becoming serene. Merchant and maritime power create confidence. Confidence seeks standardization. Standardization seeks routes secure enough to justify investment. Routes secured by one state appear to neighboring cities as domination with better bookkeeping. Hence, the peculiar restlessness of commercial polities. They always tell themselves they are protecting the circulation from which all benefit. Their rivals hear, not without reason, that they are being asked to pay for their own subordination. Arabar and the Condathan sphere more broadly stood upon this dilemma. Port wealth creates networks of obligation. Warehouses need hinterlands. Hinterlands need roads. Roads need garrisons. Garrisons need tax extraction. Tax extraction requires compliant local elites or replaceable ones. Presently, the merchant commonwealth has discovered empire and is trying to persuade itself it remains merely practical. Chesenta, by contrast, supplies the soldier's answer to the same sea. If Condath often sounds like ledgers developing teeth, Chesenta sounds like glory learning to invoice. With its untheric roots, its city-state rivalries, and its long familiarity with martial prestige, Chesenta never separated trade from war as cleanly as moralists pretend should be possible. Of course it did not. Soldiers need grain and bronze and pay chests and imported luxuries to remind themselves what they are ostensibly defending. Merchants need walls, convoy escorts, and the occasional civic myth of heroic violence to keep investment from fleeing. A sea-bound city-state learns quickly that the fleet and the market are the same institution, wearing different ceremonial robes on feast days. Consider what daily life becomes in such places. The fisher returning at dawn passes military docks on one side and spice sheds on the other. A child sees trireme beaks, tally boards, chained cargo, shrine smoke, mercenaries drinking from chipped cups, foreign sailors bargaining in a half-dozen accents, scribes calculating customs, and local politicians shouting that the rival city across the water has insulted ancestral honor by contesting some reef, island, or anchorage whose true value is measurable precisely in how many cargoes may hide behind it. Thus, maritime rivalry reproduces itself socially. Harbor children learn early that profit and pride are not enemies. They are partners in public disorder. Termish offers yet another model, and one I confess to regarding with a certain stern affection. Not innocence, never innocence, but citizenship with calluses. Termish's strength lay not in grandiose imperial fleet theory, but in the ability to turn privately owned vessels, local organization, and civic will into a militia navy when required. That arrangement, like all such arrangements, had vices. Enforcement could be inconsistent. Piracy might be overlooked when inconvenient to confront or profitable to ignore. Privately owned craft pressed into public defense do not magically cease belonging to owners with commercial preferences. Yet this very imperfection is revealing. Termish shows what happens when a maritime society embeds defense within commerce rather than pretending the two can be kept entirely apart. Ships that earn in peacetime may fight in crisis. Mariners accustomed to trade lanes become guardians of those lanes. A citizenry that understands raiding as a practical threat, not a distant abstraction, develops a rough public seriousness about patrol, signaling, and collective response. This is not the polished elegance of a royal navy. It may, under pressure, be wiser. The sea respects readiness more than pedigree. And because Termish sat in the Vilhonic world without reducing itself to any single neighboring power's logic, it also demonstrates how maritime connectedness can support stubborn local identity. A harbour does not have to become cosmopolitan in the shallow sense, by which I mean embarrassed of itself. It may trade widely and yet remain intensely itself, provided civic institutions, militias, cults, guilds, and local memory are thick enough to absorb traffic without dissolving into it. This is difficult. Many ports fail. Some become merely profitable. The better ones remain legible to their own people, even while foreigners crowd the quays. Now continue east and southeast, where older imperialisms and god-shaped states make every harbour question more solemn. Mulhorand and Unther, as we saw, lived under unusually direct divine and imperial inheritances. Such polities do not approach the sea as mere commerce. They approach it as extension of order, avenue of tribute, border of holiness, and vulnerable frontage through which disorder, foreign cults, raiders, and political infection may enter. When a god-shaped state docks a cargo, it does not see merely taxable goods. It sees ritual correctness, legitimate hierarchy, and the possibility that some insolent foreign captain has failed to render respect to the proper shrine before unloading. I recommend, for your continued existence, learning the local etiquette before disembarking in such places. Mulhorand's bureaucratic piety and Unther's imperial habit, both found in the Sea of Fallen Stars, a mixed blessing. On the one hand, maritime routes extended reach. Soldiers, envoys, temple wealth, grain, stone, and prestige move more effectively by water. On the other, the sea refuses sacral monopoly. A harbour is a leak in every ideological wall. Sailors carry jokes, cult practices, contraband icons, rumours of foreign competence, and unwelcome comparisons. The peasant inland may believe his local order uniquely ordained. The dock worker knows better. He has unloaded 6 other versions of Destiny this season, each stamped with impressive seals and each vulnerable to mildew in transit. This is one reason temple bureaucracy at maritime scale becomes so fascinating. A harbour shrine must be practical. It blesses voyages, records offerings, manages funerary requests when bodies are absent, arbitrates disputed vows, stores sailors' wills, and hears confessions no inland priest would receive because seafarers tend to sin in bulk and repent on schedules tied to the weather. Yet the same shrine may also serve as customs adjunct, intelligence node, poorhouse, employer's registry, diplomatic threshold, and unofficial insurer. When religion and administration are entangled, the sea turns every key into theology made logistical. Thay, looming to the northeast and east in later centuries, complicates the matter further. A wizard state with exportable magical authority does not require dominion over every harbour it influences. It needs only routes, clients, enclaves, dependencies, and opportunities for controlled penetration. Maritime networks are ideal for this. Goods move in bulk, reputations move faster. A red wizard enclave in a port is not only a commercial convenience, it is a statement that power may arrive packaged as service. Magical goods, trained specialists, contract terms, credit, and information all follow the sea's patient logic. If an inland road is a vein, a harbour is an open artery. Thus, even where Thaye's ships are not predominant, Thayan influence may still ride the waves by other hands. Aglarond, of course, answers such penetration with disciplined suspicion, and its coastline deserves note for precisely that reason. We spoke at length of saying no. Maritime no is a special art. One must refuse conquest without refusing trade, deny infiltration without smothering local prosperity, accept that mixed populations and wandering mariners are facts without letting every foreign venture become a permanent hook in local flesh. Harbours in such realms are not merely economic points, they are tests of sovereignty repeated daily. Who unloads, who pays, who watches, who settles, who prays, who leaves. Which warehouse is merely a warehouse, and which is tomorrow's embassy, spy nest, cult cellar, or mercenary pay office. You begin to see, I hope, why ports age people. A governor may rule farms by decree. Harbours interrogate decrees line by line. And all across the southeastern waters, this produced one of the great recurrent truths of Faerûnian history. Empire building in the realms is constrained less often by the inability to move power than by the inability to digest what movement brings back. A fleet can carry tribute home. It also carries dissent, foreign artisans, novel luxuries, disease, dockside criminal methods, imported gods, displaced persons, and the dangerous knowledge that other states, however inferior they may be in official rhetoric, have solved some practical problems rather well. Inland ideologues dream in purity. Seaborne empires wake to invoices, multilingual crews, and the embarrassing efficiency of foreigners. This is why the Sea of Fallen Stars served not merely as connector, but as tutor. It taught every shore a lesson it would rather have learned about its neighbors than about itself. The lesson was interdependence. And interdependence in Faerûn as elsewhere is the condition from which both sophistication and paranoia are born. Naturally, where interdependence ripens, predation follows, like mold in a damp archive. Let us talk then of pirates. Not romantically. I am too old for that indulgence, and you are listening to the wrong undead archivist if you hoped for moonlit nonsense about freedom with a cutlass and an admirably windswept disregard for property. Piracy in the Sea of Fallen Stars was, as piracy usually is, a profession born from the same structures that make legitimate trade possible. Dense traffic, valuable cargoes, irregular enforcement, hidden anchorages, political fragmentation, experienced mariners in periodic want of lawful work, sponsors eager for plausible deniability, coastal markets willing to buy unstamped goods, and enough local misery that men begin to call seizure an economic philosophy. The Pirate Isles make the point dramatically because the geography itself seems to conspire on behalf of crime. Scores of rocky islands, harsh cliffs, limited natural ports, hidden approaches, secret holds, reefs, sudden weather, and enough distance from some coasts to complicate response while remaining close enough to all to threaten them. Such places do not create pirates by themselves, but they reduce the startup costs. A pirate sanctuary is rarely a lawless void. It is an alternative institution. Someone apportions anchorage. Someone arbitrates spoils disputes. Someone trades powder, rope, sailcloth, salt meat, lamp oil, stolen wine, and the favors of information. Someone decides whether a captured ship is worth ransom, resale, or quiet sinking. Someone arranges black market buyers on the mainland. Someone keeps track of which authorities may be bribed, which may be threatened, and which have become inconveniently virtuous this season. Even criminals require administration. Indeed, criminals often require more of it because trust is expensive, where hanging is a common professional hazard. The pirate wars after the death of the pirate lord Immerk illustrate another useful truth. Piracy is not the opposite of politics. It is politics stripped of heraldry. When Immerk died in 1201 DR, his rough coalition fractured. Rival claimants contended, strongholds changed hands, violence intensified, and the Dragon Isle became the sort of prize over which ambitious men lie most sincerely about principle. Erdogan eventually dominated there, but the broader lesson matters more than the name. Maritime predation, once organized, develops succession crises exactly as states do. It generates factions, patronage, inheritance disputes of a sort, and struggles over legitimacy that may look crude only because the paperwork is bloodier. And after the internal struggle came the usual external phase. Having sorted themselves enough to function, the pirates turned with renewed appetite toward the coasts, raiding villages and shipping, forcing the inner sea powers to reckon with them. This, too, is instructive. Fragmented violence often first devours itself, then discovers neighbors. Now, every coastal state condemns piracy in official language. Nearly every coastal state, at one time or another, finds uses for it. The forms vary. A merchant consortium may quietly purchase the protection of certain routes while allowing rivals to suffer. A city-state may license captains to prey on an enemy under terms sufficiently deniable that public treaties survive. A local governor may look the other way so long as contraband passes through a preferred broker. A navy short on funds may enforce law where politically advantageous and rediscover legal ambiguity elsewhere. A ruler may publicly rage at depredations while privately enjoying the pressure those same depredations place upon a rival's customs revenue. This is what I mean when I say piracy is unofficial policy. Not always. Some pirates are merely hungry jackals with a sail and more nerve than arithmetic. But in a mature maritime basin, the line between pirate, corsair, smuggler, private raider, patriotic nuisance, and deniable naval auxiliary becomes so thin that only widows and accountants care to distinguish it carefully. Widows because names matter to grief. Accountants because names matter to liability. Westgate understood this ambiguity. So did many a Sembian interest, though merchant respectability prefers cologne to confession. Cormier, being institutionally prouder, usually preferred cleaner lines, but even proud states must sometimes choose whether pursuing every lawbreaker is worth the convoy delays, costs, and political complications involved. Termish, with its militia navy, knew especially well how porous the boundary could become when privately owned vessels were expected to serve public defense. The same captain who escorts local trade one month may conduct suspiciously selective commerce the next. Maritime basins do not reward moral categories unaccompanied by enforcement capacity. The sea turns hypocrisy from vice into operating system. Yet piracy is useful to the historian for more than moral disappointment. It reveals what coastal societies truly value. Listen not to the proclamations, but to the response patterns. Which cargoes provoke swift retaliation? Which merchants receive escorts and which are left to Umberlee? Which villages are avenged? Which disappear into the record as regrettable losses? Which pirate captains are pursued relentlessly and which somehow continue selling goods through familiar intermediaries? There you will find the real constitution of a maritime polity. When a government says, "We cannot possibly suppress all raiding," what it usually means is, "We have determined which raiding is intolerable to our actual priorities." Maritime fear also produces maritime invention. Convoys, signal systems, beacon fires, fast couriers, patrol schedules, marine insurance schemes, hidden compartments, armed merchants, harbour booms, chain defences, and a whole intimate craft of lying about cargoes all flourish under the pressure of predation. This means pirates, loathsome though they are, indirectly help institutionalize the basin they exploit. A sea unthreatened breeds laxity. A sea frequently threatened breeds method. The sea of fallen stars, richly unfortunate in this respect, bred a great many methods. You can see the larger pattern, I trust. Trade leads to predation. Predation leads to security. Security leads to taxation, standardization, and bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, in turn, creates opportunities for evasion, favoritism, and corruption, which reopen the field for predation in subtler clothes. Thus, the sea becomes not a backdrop to statecraft, but one of its most efficient engines. We should say a word here as well about ships themselves, because vessel types are the skeleton of maritime possibility. The common trade on the inner sea in later centuries relied heavily on cogs, round ships, and carracks, with caravels increasingly present. Now, I promise not to spend the next hour murmuring lovingly about rigging geometry, though there are worse ways to waste undeath. What matters historically is that ship design constrains cargo volume, speed, crew size, draft, maneuverability, and therefore route choice, harbour infrastructure, and military viability. A basin dominated by shallow draft coasters behaves differently from one ruled by deeper, larger merchantmen. A pirate accustomed to fast strikes from a hidden cove chooses differently than a navy responsible for sustained patrol and convoy work. A port dredged for larger hulls acquires advantages smaller neighbours may resent for generations. Even the language of ships leaks ashore. Dockside slang enters markets, then councils, then literature. People begin to speak of currents in politics, shoals in law, cargoes of rumour, storms in the Guildhall, and men who change loyalties with the tide. An inland baron may think himself immune to such speech until his grandson marries a merchant's daughter, and suddenly the family estates are being described in terms suspiciously nautical. This is how cultural circulation works. Slow at first, then everywhere. And still, despite all the administration, the inner sea never belonged wholly to those who named its surface routes. The pirate isles persisted. Smuggling persisted. Neutral waters beyond the 10-mile limit remained zones of temptation. Customs seals were forged. Manifests were altered mid-voyage. Cargoes changed ownership 3 times between dock and warehouse. Fishermen became informants. Harbour pilots became kingmakers in miniature. Small islands with little apparent worth gained immense value because they offered water, concealment, repair space, or legal ambiguity. A rock in the sea is never merely a rock if ships can hide behind it. This is why inland sea politics is so obsessed with minor places. A reef, an anchorage, a volcanic island, an otherwise ridiculous strip of coast. These become strategic because traffic exists. The Sea of Fallen Stars taught generations of rulers the humiliating truth that history sometimes hinges not upon great capitals alone, but upon boring nautical necessities. Where fresh water may be taken, where hulls may be careened, where storms break, where pilots change over, where the channel deepens, where a cargo may wait unseen for 3 nights until the right buyer arrives. Perhaps that is why I like the sounding lead. Great empires tell history through proclamations. The sea tells it through depth, bottom, and anchorage. But let us move from pirates to the more reputable predators, navies. A navy on the Sea of Fallen Stars is never merely a military instrument. It is an argument about what a state thinks the sea is for. Cormier's Imperial Navy, for example, reveals a monarchy committed to treating maritime security as extension of royal order. Patrol, escort, deterrence, prestige, customs support, coastal response. These are administrative as much as martial tasks. The fleet exists not only to defeat enemy hulls, though that remains a pleasing side effect. It exists to reassure merchants, discipline smugglers, project credible authority into contested waters, and make the Crown's promises feel materially true. When a convoy reaches port under escort, that is not simply commerce preserved. It is monarchy rendered visible in timber and sail. Sembia's maritime strength, by contrast, reflects a mercantile civilization whose shipping capacity, sailors, corsairs, and port investments turn commerce itself into strategic instrument. Its vessels are not simply protected by the state. In a deep sense, they are the state, or at least the state form toward which Sembia's habits perpetually incline. Merchant marine tonnage, coastal partnerships, convoy organization, chartering capacity, and the ability to redirect freight quickly. All of this becomes political leverage. A realm like Sembia may fight with warships, certainly. It may also fight with credit, delay, preferential access, and market saturation. On an inland sea, economic power can be naval power by quieter means. Termish, as I noted, provides the civic militia model, privately owned vessels that can be commandeered as needed to combat pirates and protect routes. This arrangement tells us that Termish treats defense not as a separate caste's business, but as shared burden among those already dependent on the waters. It is messy. It blurs public and private interest. It may even overlook piracy when inconveniently expensive to suppress. Yet it also produces a maritime citizenry for whom defense is not theatrical pageantry, but continuation of commercial life by sterner tools. Impiltor's smaller but hardy war fleet shows something else. One need not dominate an inland sea to matter on it. Persistent presence, local familiarity, disciplined escort, and a reputation for responding can make even a modest navy strategically weighty. The sea rewards those who show up reliably. Empty boasts sail poorly. In the southeast and east, where old empires and wizardly interests complicate coastline politics, naval power often interlaces with border ambiguity, cult authority, and magical supplementation. Here fleets guard not merely cargo, but legitimacy. A patrol vessel may be policing fishermen, smuggling, spies, heretics, escaped slaves, deserters, or politically inconvenient priests, depending upon whose shoreline one nears. The same hull may be welcomed as guardian in one port and cursed as floating extortion office in the next. This is why shipping is diplomacy, not metaphorically, literally. A treaty on the Sea of Fallen Stars means very little unless translated into docking rights, inspection privileges, tariff rates, convoy agreements, salvage rules, prisoner exchanges, pilot access, repair permissions, beacon maintenance, and mutual understandings about whose dead may be buried, where, when a vessel founders under mixed crew. Maritime diplomacy is concrete in the most insulting way. High rhetoric descends into rope allotments and wharf usage almost at once. Suppose, if you like, a royal marriage binds two houses in peace. Charming. Now ask the practical questions. Do the merchants of one realm gain reduced customs in the other's ports? Will warships receive emergency provisioning? Are harbor priests of a certain cult guaranteed rights of burial or blessing? May convicted smugglers flee across the water and claim sanctuary under different law? If a pirate vessel takes refuge in a neutral roadstead, who may pursue? If plague is suspected aboard a grain ship destined for an allied city, does duty to treaty outweigh quarantine law? There, my apprentice. There lies diplomacy with its finery stripped away. The Sea of Fallen Stars forced governments to become competent at such humiliations or pay for incompetence repeatedly. Even the 10-mile territorial convention, recognized among inner sea states, deserves more than passing notice. On its face, it is a practical boundary. Within 10 miles of shore, attacks on shipping may be construed as acts of war. Beyond, neutral waters begin. But conventions of this kind do more than divide jurisdiction. They create common political grammar. Once rival states acknowledge, however grudgingly, a shared rule about maritime space, they admit belonging to a basin-wide order larger than any one crown. This does not end conflict. Quite the opposite. It refines conflict. Powers argue over measurements, islands, shoals, estuaries, and disputed coasts precisely because the rule matters. Law does not abolish violence. It gives violence finer teeth. Such conventions also nourish the professions of interpretation. Harbor lawyers, maritime judges, customs commissioners, naval clerks, salvage brokers, and temple scribes begin to proliferate wherever traffic is dense enough that loss and argument become routine. Few classes are more underrated by ballads. A clever maritime clerk may determine the fate of more wealth in a season than many knights see in their lives. He can delay, validate, misfile, endorse, question, confiscate, or accelerate. By the gods, I have seen wars nearly begin because a manifest was challenged at precisely the wrong political moment, and three touchy men in expensive sleeves decided procedure was an insult. Never laugh at paperwork when tariffs are involved. The sea also changes the internal sociology of states. Consider the port city compared to the inland capital. An inland capital often imagines itself the mind of the realm. A major port often suspects it is the stomach, lungs, and purse, and grows understandably impatient when the mind insists upon ceremonial precedence, while the purse pays dock wages and the lungs breathe spice dust. Tensions between court and port, inland nobility and maritime guilds, temple purity and dockside practicality, military command and merchant calculation. These are not incidental frictions. They are defining features of inland sea civilization. Marsemba will never think exactly like a forest manor, nor Selgaunt like a farming town, nor Westgate like a pious inland shrine settlement, nor Alahon like a frontier garrison. Their built environment teaches different instincts. In port cities, time is measured by arrivals, departures, tides, auctions, and inspections. People learn to live with strangers, shortages, glut, and rumor. Storage becomes strategic. Labor becomes seasonal in complicated ways. Crime becomes logistically inventive. Religion becomes portable. Fashion becomes comparative. Accent becomes social currency. Local identity survives, certainly, but it survives under constant abrasion. This makes ports both more adaptive and more unstable than inland societies usually prefer to imagine. It also makes them ideal breeding grounds for intermediaries, translators, brokers, factors, warehouse keepers, fixer priests, money changers, scribes for hire, pilot guides, salvage experts, fence masters, caravan coordinators, discreet bodyguards, interpreters of customs law, procurers of cargo space, and all the shadow trades that prosper between official institutions. An inland kingdom can sometimes pretend power descends neatly from throne to village. A maritime basin laughs at such innocence. Too many hands touch everything. Hence, the importance of reputation. On the Sea of Fallen Stars, reputation can be more valuable than armament and more fragile than glass. A port known for fair weights, swift adjudication, tolerable fees, competent rescue response, and limited corruption attracts trade even if its ruler is tedious. A port known for arbitrary seizure, unpaid debts, drunken harbour officials, collusive piracy, or temple extortion may keep some traffic through force or geography, but merchants will build alternative habits as soon as possible. States learn this slowly, deny it loudly, and then learn it again whenever revenue falls. You may see now why I say shipping is diplomacy. Every harbour is a standing negotiation between local power and foreign need. But diplomacy moves more than goods and coin. It moves people, and people are the most troublesome cargo of all. Before we follow those people, let us linger one moment longer on the harbour itself, because infrastructure has a daily life, and daily life is where civilizations become real. A port on the Sea of Fallen Stars is not only quays and noble customs houses. It is rope walks that smell of hemp and tar, sail lofts where canvas is patched by hands too busy to care about diplomacy, cooperies ringing with mallets, chandlers with inventories full of necessary dullness, fishwives who know more about local weather than court astrologers, porters whose backs preserve the fiction that great commerce is elegant, warehouse watchmen learning which guild insignia merit deference and which invite burglary, tavern keepers who extend credit to captains they trust and deny it to officials they know will survive on ceremony if drink is refused, children counting hulls for fun and therefore becoming, in time, better judges of maritime traffic than many appointed overseers, widows negotiating over shares, sailmakers, caulkers, net menders, tide readers, lightermen, prostitutes, accountants, pilgrims, beggars, carters, interpreters, and the whole indispensable crowd by which a basin becomes usable. There are social consequences to this concentration of labor. Port districts create classes of people whose expertise does not fit the neat categories inland elites prefer. A dock foreman may command more immediate obedience in his ward than a minor noble. A pilot may insult men of rank by correcting them and suffer no lasting penalty because grounding a ship to preserve etiquette is costly even by aristocratic standards. Women's labor, often underestimated in grand histories, thickens here in visible and invisible forms. Market management, provisioning, boarding houses, bookkeeping, shrine work, sail repair, credit extension, kinship networking, information handling. Ports remember, through households as much as through guild roles, who pays, who drowns, who cheats, who returns, and who lies about both cargo and intention. Thus the sea changes family life as well as statecraft. Absence becomes normal. Return becomes uncertain. Inheritance grows complicated. Marriage stretches across coasts. Orphans become apprentices. Debt travels. Mourning acquires maritime habits. The body not recovered, the prayer delayed, the chest opened in witnesses' presence, the ring sold, the birth rented to another soul with better luck or worse judgment. Only a fool studies maritime history and neglects grief. Migration by sea is rarely remembered with the dignity rulers reserve for conquest, yet it may alter a region more thoroughly than many wars. Armies arrive declared. Migrants arrive in families. Work crews, apprenticeships, debt arrangements, marriages, seasonal labor streams, refugee clusters, temple retinues, shipboard friendships, captains' patronage chains, and the slow, relentless transfer of skill. A realm may notice an invasion at once. It may take 2 generations to notice that its dockside speech, cuisine, contract forms, funerary customs, and artisanal methods have changed because people kept arriving with reasons that did not fit heroic chronicles. The Sea of Fallen Stars excelled at this kind of historical quietude. A sailor from one coast winters on another and leaves with a spouse, a debt, a patron, and a god newly added to his already crowded theology. A cooper follows work to a busier harbour and teaches his sons an accent their grandfather would distrust. A temple sends junior clergy by ship because roads are unsafe, and those clergy establish side chapels in port districts among foreigners who come to depend on them. Refugees from a raid settle near the quays because inland landholding is closed to them, then become chandlers, rope makers, fishmongers, pilots, or criminal specialists depending on luck and the moral tone of their landlords. A mercenary company contracts passage, fights abroad, returns with coin and stories, and purchases property in a city that now contains veterans whose loyalties and enemies were made elsewhere. Soon, the basin is peopled not only by natives of its shores, but by circulators. Circulators change everything. They marry across local lines. They require law flexible enough to accommodate strangers and rigid enough to discipline them when convenient. They create demand for translators, hostels, boarding houses, specialized markets, remittance networks, and familiar shrines. They unsettle inherited status hierarchies because port wealth and maritime skill permit forms of advancement land-bound aristocracies find vulgar. A noble may dismiss a ship captain until his own grain stores depend upon the man's punctuality. Thus, coastal societies repeatedly generate modest but potent corrections to purely hereditary arrogance. Not enough corrections, alas. never enough, yet some. This is why the Sea of Fallen Stars helps explain the recurring Faerûnian presence of adventurers, mercenary bands, agents, and mobile specialists. Long before a wandering company enters a tavern in the minds of storytellers, the basin has already normalized transience. Not everyone who travels by sea becomes an adventurer, of course. Most become tired. But a society accustomed to strangers with skills, contracts, cargoes, and unclear pasts is socially better prepared to accommodate freelance power than one in which every face has known every other face for 3 generations and regards novelty as either marriage prospect or witchcraft. Port cities are training grounds in practical pluralism, not generous pluralism. Do not be sentimental. Practical pluralism. People who share docks learn coexistence less from lofty ideals than from the ruinous inconvenience of constant open conflict. If the grain ship has arrived, the foreign crew may be ugly, impious, overpaid, and perfumed offensively, but the market still needs unloading. If the repair yard requires dwarven metalwork, the local xenophobe may continue his speech while quietly paying the bill. If a shrine to a foreign deity attracts mariners whose offerings support nearby taverns and chandlers, doctrinal objections often acquire softer edges after a few profitable seasons. The sea does not make people better. It makes purity expensive. This matters enormously to religion. On land, a temple may dominate a district by habit and inheritance. At sea, divine competition becomes more intimate. Every major harbor on the Sea of Fallen Stars developed a religious ecology shaped by peril, trade, and mixed populations. Umberlee naturally loomed over all in one form or another, for the Bitch Queen's genius lies in forcing even those who despise her to account for her. Sailors may love better gods, nobler gods, luckier gods, gentler gods. When the squall wall rises black over open water, they still remember whose wrath needs soothing. Harbor shrines to Umberlee thrive not because she is beloved, but because fear is faithful where affection hesitates. A practical civilization quickly learns the difference between veneration and propitiation. Valcour's followers, where his cult held sway, offered another maritime theology altogether. Courage, seamanship, the honest acceptance of peril, the wind's liberty without surrender to chaos. Joaquin touched the basin through commerce and contracts, Gond through shipbuilding, repair, and devices, Saloon through navigation and night voyaging, Timora through gamblers, captains, and fools with luck enough to become local legends rather than anonymous corpses. Tempest received prayers before battle. Chauntea was thanked when grain arrived unspoiled. Ilmater heard dockside sorrows. Lathander blessed new ventures. And the local and regional cults of Mulhorand, Unther, Chesenta, Cormier, Sembia, and elsewhere all adapted in their own ways to the key. The forecast, the missing body, the returning vessel, the debt carried across water, the burial without corpse, the vow made during lightning and remembered inconveniently in harbour calm. A maritime chapel is one of civilization's truest rooms. There you find fear stripped of ornament. Priests in such places become administrators of uncertainty. They bless voyages, record offerings, keep messages for the missing, store wills, witness contracts, provide letters of standing, identify drowned bodies when possible, and console the families when not. They arbitrate which vow outranks which, when a captain has promised 1/10 of his profits to one god, a silver anchor to another, sobriety to a third, and reform of morals to a fourth, all in the span of a single memorable storm. They also listen. Ah, how they listen. A harbour priest hears more intelligence than many diplomats because sailors confess indirectly, merchants complain specifically, widows ask precise questions, and smugglers overestimate the absolving power of donations. Never underestimate the archive value of a quayside shrine. Religious circulation by sea also spreads ideas inland. Relics travel, hymns travel, liturgical habits travel. So do heresies, splinter cults, cultic fashions, and hybrid practices too useful to die simply because a theologian disapproves. A God-shaped state may proclaim orthodoxy. The port district will respond by developing a working arrangement with reality. People who trade, marry, hire crews, and survive storms together generate theologies of coexistence or at least mutual toleration at a pace formal doctrine struggles to regulate. Sometimes this enriches religion, sometimes it vulgarizes it. Usually it does both. And then there are plagues. An inland road spreads disease. A sea lane can distribute it with unnerving efficiency, especially when crowded ports, poor sanitation, transient populations, packed holds, rats, standing water, spoiled provisions, and commercial urgency conspire against prudence. Maritime basins therefore create one of the most uncomfortable forms of governance: quarantine. Nothing tests a port's political seriousness quite like the arrival of profitable cargo under suspicion of contamination. Merchants plead urgency. Officials cite law. Priests invoke duty to the living and the dead. Dock laborers demand wages. Hungry cities eye the anchored grain. Smugglers scent opportunity. Rumor outruns evidence by several docks' length. What is a state really made of? Ask it whether it can afford to turn away a tainted ship. The Sea of Fallen Stars, by linking so many coasts, ensured that public health, though they would not have named it in so modern and tedious a phrase, became part of maritime governance. Inspection, isolation, cargo delay, fumigation by whatever imperfect means local law recommended, controlled unloading, restrictions on crew movement, special burial practice, emergency temple work, and compensatory market manipulations all emerged not from theory, but from necessity. The sea punishes slow learning. One rotten voyage teaches harsher lessons than a library of civic sermons. Rumor, too, behaves like a kind of disease in maritime basins, though more profitable and often more entertaining. News traveling by sea does not move in clean official form. It arrives layered. A captain bears a sealed dispatch. His first mate carries a better version learned from a harbour mistress 2 ports back. The cook knows what the refugees said before disembarking. A mercenary on the lower deck heard that the war is already over. A priest on board insists the omens say the opposite. By the time the vessel docks, the harbour has been infected with 6 incompatible truths, and one of them, exasperatingly, will matter. This is why inland rulers so often distrust ports, not merely because of vice or smuggling, though both flourish. Ports are epistemological insurgencies. They make certainty difficult. Too many eyewitnesses, too many foreign standards, too many contradictory reports, too much comparison, too much knowledge of alternatives. An inland court can maintain illusions for years if roads are bad enough. A busy harbour perforates them daily. And because the Sea of Fallen Stars tied together regions of strikingly different political character: monarchies, merchant powers, city-states, temple-heavy states, wizardly spheres, militia cultures, oligarchic ports, imperial survivals, and borderland societies. The circulation of rumor across it was especially destabilizing. The mere fact that other arrangements existed, prospered, failed, adapted, or lied differently was politically significant. The sea educated by comparison. It is hard to persuade a dock worker that his ruler's customs are universal when he unloaded 5 other systems before midsummer. Even cuisine becomes historical evidence under such conditions. Fish preserved one way in one reach appears seasoned differently in another. Spices shift northward. Wine jars circulate. Pickled fruits move. Harbor stews become small, edible maps of contact. Fashion follows bolts of cloth and decorative goods. Oaths pick up foreign turns of phrase. Musical modes hitch rides with bards and sailors. Harbor slang seeps into urban speech, then inland aspiration. Children of mixed households become ordinary in districts where their grandparents would have been novelties. A basin develops slowly but unmistakably, a littoral civilization. Not uniform, never uniform, but mutually legible in ways isolated inland societies are not. All this from ships. No, that is too simple. All this from repeated, structured contact under conditions of risk. And now we come to the part surface histories are most eager to omit. The sea has inhabitants. Yes, I know, this observation appears almost offensively basic, yet human, dwarven, elven, and mixed surface chronicles routinely write as though water were empty until a named ship entered it. They record coast guards, ports, pirates, navies, tariffs, and wrecks with admirable diligence, while rendering the vast life below as either monster catalogue or picturesque obstacle. This is not merely an oversight, it is a habit of political imagination. Surface states prefer routes to realms. The Sea of Fallen Stars does not indulge that preference. Its undersea worlds were known collectively to their inhabitants as Seeros. There beneath the keels lay not blank depth, but polities, trade languages, battle traditions, migrations, dynastic memories, sacred sites, and ancient enmities. Aquatic elves, merfolk, sawagin, dragon turtles, aquatic dwarves in their reclusive obscurity, and stranger peoples, besides, inhabited the inner sea in ways surface chroniclers rarely grasped, unless compelled by violence or rare diplomacy. There were cities such as Mithnantar, shifting alliances, markets where pearls and coral meant more than surface coins, and legal or customary orders whose relation to the dry world was intermittent rather than non-existent. This matters for 3 reasons. First, it demolishes the sentimental notion that the sea is free space. No such thing. A ship passes above jurisdictions it does not acknowledge and dangers it barely understands. The surface captain, calculating neutral waters beyond 10 miles, may feel legally secure while crossing to undersea eyes the approaches to a reef kingdom, a Sahuagin hunting route, a dragon turtle's preferred domain, or sacred ground attached to an entirely different history of sovereignty. Maritime law above and below do not neatly coincide. Indeed, their mismatch is one of the basin's enduring sources of surprise. Second, it changes the meaning of wreckage. To surface states, a wreck may be loss, salvage prospect, insurance disaster, pirate opportunity, or future tale. To undersea peoples, it may also be resource field, shrine, hazard, burial site, political token, or source of trade goods. The floor of the Sea of Fallen Stars, thick with shipwrecks over the centuries, was not a silent museum. It was a working layer of accumulation. Goods sank, hulls rotted, cargo dispersed, metal corroded, timbers sheltered new life, and whole chapters of surface ambition became undersea inventory. There is a kind of justice in this, though not a comforting one. Third, Seiros reveals that communication between worlds, when it happened, often exposed the narrowness of surface assumptions. Surface merchants imagine coin as universal. Many undersea traders preferred barter or valued pearls differently, producing those delicious mismatches by which each side suspects the other mad until profit clarifies the grammar. Surface diplomats imagine written contract as apex of civilization. Undersea powers may operate through older codes, customary war laws, or languages impractical for lungs. Surface priests imagine their gods must have traveled by doctrine. Sometimes faith travels instead through the rescued, the stranded, the intermarried, the curious, or the simply opportunistic. Do you see how good this is for history? The Sea of Fallen Stars is not merely a road among coasts. It is a layered contact zone in vertical as well as horizontal terms. One of the most revealing developments came when undersea and surface trade increased more openly in the late 14th century. In and around Myth Nantar and allied waters, communication with ports such as Selgant and Suzail expanded. Surface goods, sculptures, pickled fruits, crafted wares, shaped metalwork met undersea gold, coral, pearls, and objects long lost to the seafloor. Even that phrase should give you pause. Long lost to the seafloor. To whom lost? To the surface, perhaps, not to those below. A sunken cargo may be tragedy in one ledger and inventory in another. Naturally, such contact also produced resentment. Those who had grown fat on harvesting the deep by dangerous labor did not always welcome competition from peoples who simply lived there and could retrieve what divers risked death to reach. Hence the inevitable tales: sea folk stealing children, sea folk attacking divers without cause, sea folk dangerous, untrustworthy, alien, not to be treated as proper partners. How quickly commerce produces prejudice when accustomed monopolies are threatened. I am sure you are shocked. The Sahuagin deserve special mention because they remind us that undersea politics could break violently into surface awareness. For long stretches, many undersea affairs remained obscure to landfolk, who enjoyed the luxury of ignorance because the depths largely kept their own counsel. Then the balance shifted, as balances do, and the sea remembered its teeth. Raids, wars, ruptured barriers, movements of violent aquatic powers, such events turned the comfortable surface fiction of an empty or merely scenic basin into immediate panic. A coastal village learning that the water itself has politics is rather like a man discovering his cellar has constitutional opinions. This is also why the religious significance of the sea differs from mere weather fear. When sailors propitiate Umberlee or invoke more kindly maritime powers, they do not only fear storm, they fear unknowability. Storm may drown you, depth may reinterpret your world. Beneath the ship are lives that do not organize themselves around your ports, your tribute systems, your human calendars, or your myths of terrestrial centrality. A sailor need not be a philosopher to feel small before that. A wise sailor turns the feeling into ritual. An unwise sailor calls it superstition and then drowns with admirable rational consistency. Now, I do not wish to romanticize Syros any more than I romanticize the surface. Undersea peoples fought brutal wars of their own. The Sahuagin, especially, earned the dread in which many held them. Alliances below were no more pure than those above. Trade had its own manipulations. Superiority complexes are not confined to air breathers, yet the existence of this underworld beneath the inner sea helps complete tonight's central claim. The basin is an engine of history precisely because it is crowded. Crowded laterally by coasts and vertically by layers of life, rule, memory, and conflict. A surface map that shows only shorelines is not false. It is merely incomplete in a way that becomes dangerous if mistaken for completeness. There is a more philosophical point here as well, one suitable to an archivist and perhaps to a patient apprentice. The Sea of Fallen Stars teaches humility about perspective. Every shoreline people, every empire, every merchant consortium, every priesthood, every pirate captain, every customs office, every admiralty board tends toward the same flattering error. The belief that the water's primary function is to carry the consequences of their own intentions. But the water carries other consequences too. It archives, it conceals, it redistributes. It remembers collapse long after surface dynasties have changed their seals. How many ambitions lie on the floor of that basin? How many censers, helms, amphorae, ingots, idols, letters sealed against damp and betrayed by it nonetheless, coins stamped by dead powers, charms whispered over by forgotten mothers, chain links, ballista bolts, splintered mastheads, pearl-set relic cases, shackles, bones and kitchen knives. An inland ruin can often be seen and named. A maritime ruin works more quietly. It remains active in salvage, rumor, legend, navigation and fear. Men speak of waters where old wrecks lie thick and alter routes accordingly. Divers recover a trove and change a season's markets. A resurfaced island or exposed tower after some magical or geological convulsion suddenly becomes meeting place, hideout, shrine or prize because history, which had sunk, has chosen a fresh angle of re-entry. You understand now why the later draining and refilling convulsions of the sea during the Spell Plague and Second Sundering mattered so much. Even when our present episode's main temporal focus lies earlier, the long engine continues. The basin itself can change, revealing wrecks, marooning ports inland, swallowing them again, turning islands to peninsulas and back, reminding every state around it that geography in the realms is not always the settled partner mortals imagine. The sea's later draining into the deep rifts and its swelling return in the great rain are not aberrations to be dismissed. They are revelations of a constant truth. Infrastructure built on wonder and catastrophe remains answerable to both. Which is to say, the sea is a road only on terms the world keeps revising. And that, I think, is enough depth for the moment. Let us rise again to the surface and ask what all these movements, trade, piracy, naval organization, migration, religion, rumor, and hidden sovereignties actually did to the nations around the Sea of Fallen Stars over the long age we have been tracing. What did the Sea of Fallen Stars do then to the nations that ringed it? It made them less innocent than they pretended. That sounds severe. Good. Severity is appropriate. Cormyr could not remain merely forest monarchy once maritime access required customs, shipbuilding, convoy practice, harbour governance, and naval credibility. Sembia could not remain merely merchant wealth once shipping networks, sailors, corsairs, and basin-wide commercial leverage taught money how to behave like sovereignty. Westgate could not remain merely a city if routes, vice, logistics, and negotiable legality made it a translator between respectable and disreputable systems. Chondath and Chesenta could not remain local rivals because the waters magnified every quarrel into trade consequence and every trade consequence into political insult. Termish could not remain simply a pleasant southern realm because patrol, militia shipping, and route security turned citizenship itself toward maritime defense. Mulhorand and Unther could not keep their divine and imperial orders sealed from the destabilizing traffic of harbors. Aglarond could not practice refusal as a purely inland art. They could not export power efficiently without learning the sea's habits, whether directly or through intermediaries. Even the Dale lands, which did not themselves front the great waters in the obvious way, felt the basin through prices, merchant appetite, route demands, and the growing reach of neighboring economies shaped by maritime circulation. And none of them, not one, could fully control the consequences once motion began. This is perhaps the defining feature of inland ocean civilization. The very systems that enrich and strengthen a polity also compromise its dream of isolation. A port that grows prosperous on exchange cannot later decide without cost that foreign influence is intolerable. A merchant realm that profits from far markets cannot complain coherently when far markets return the favor by shaping its internal priorities. A monarchy that builds a navy to protect trade also creates offices, dock districts, supply chains, and maritime interests with their own political weight. A temple that spreads by sea learns that devotion carried in cargo holds arrives mixed with foreign habits. A city that thrives on transient labor and shipboard opportunity will inevitably shelter men and women whose loyalties are layered, rented, private, or in motion. The sea makes clean categories expensive. It also makes delayed consequences inevitable. A raid in the Pirate Isles may mean widows in one coast town, higher escort prices in another, a shortage in a third, political embarrassment in a fourth, and sudden opportunity for a black market broker in a fifth. A storm in the Alamba Sea may capsize grain meant for a hinterland that never sees the water, yet whose bread now rises in cost. A new custom in Selgant may redirect traffic toward a rival port, enrich a warehouse district elsewhere, impoverish a guild here, and produce 3 seasons later a municipal crisis everyone insists is purely local. Refugees from a burned coast carry not only hunger, but stories. Stories alter recruitment, fear, law, and cult behavior. A diplomatic insult given in one harbour reaches another faster than apologies composed inland. By the time the council meets, the market has already voted. You see why historians who love neat borders find inland seas unbearable. Good, let them suffer. For if you truly wish to understand the long age of kingdoms, you must stop imagining kingdoms as solitary blocks of color on parchment and start seeing them as permeable arrangements around moving channels of people, goods, belief, and force. Roads matter, forests matter, mountains matter. But the sea of fallen stars demonstrates with unusual ruthlessness that a body of water may serve as the central nervous system of a region without ever achieving the courtesy of stability. It speeds contact. It multiplies scale. It rewards competence. It punishes complacency. It enriches ports. It attracts predators. It humbles ideologues. It fosters hybrid cultures. It spreads disease. It carries armies. It nourishes piety and hypocrisy in equal measure. It keeps secrets at depth and throws some of them back ashore when convenient. Let me make the point in another way. Imagine for a moment a single merchant vessel, not a legendary one, merely a competent hull with a captain old enough to distrust grand speeches and young enough to risk profit anyway. She leaves the western waters under Cormyrean protection, her hold carrying worked metal, casks of oil, cloth, tools, and letters sealed with wax more carefully than wisdom. In Marsemba or Suzail, she takes aboard a junior priest traveling to settle a family dispute over inheritance in a distant port. Two mercenaries whose contract was dissolved after a border truce made them temporarily surplus, and a scribe sent by a merchant house to audit accounts nobody local wishes audited. She reaches Sembian waters. There the cargo shifts. Some goods unload into warehouses before dawn because taxes are less poetic in daylight. Credit instruments change hands. A chest of coin does not travel farther because parchment is lighter, though parchment is easier to steal if one knows which clerk is lonely. New passengers board, a factor's nephew, a singer with more patrons than scruples, 3 sailors from another coast who claim they are only transferring berths and absolutely not evading debt, and a matron carrying household gods wrapped in linens because her daughter has married into a family 2 reaches away. At Westgate, the voyage darkens and fattens. A consignment whose paperwork is impeccable and whose provenance is appalling appears as if by spontaneous generation. A captain dines with a man she would never acknowledge in public and leaves with information about pirates farther east, and a warning that some coastal authority intends unusually strict inspections this month. One mercenary departs for work too dubious to describe. Another passenger arrives under a name that is almost certainly rented. Southward and eastward, the ship touches Chondathan and Chesantan circuits. Wine comes aboard. So do stories of civic insult, troop movements, and the latest heroic fool who imagines glory and solvency natural allies. Harbour boys shout in accents that already blend worlds. A philosopher, which is to say a man who has not paid his own freight in 3 ports, lectures the crew on politics until the cook threatens him with a ladle. A local priest insists upon proper offerings before departure. The captain gives them because even unbelief at sea is rarely doctrinal enough to be suicidal. In Termish, the vessel shares anchorage with privately owned craft that may, upon the right alarm, become militia navy. Here, civic order feels different, less hierarchical perhaps, but no less serious where routes and patrols are concerned. A widow seeks passage for her son to apprenticeship in another harbour because his father died fighting raiders, and there is no future for him inland. 2 barrels of preserved fish replace the philosopher, who disembarks full of opinions and unpaid drink. An adventuring band, unmistakable in the way all such bands are unmistakable, attempts to book cheap passage in exchange for promises of protection. The captain refuses, having lived long enough to know that adventurers are excellent at generating trouble and only intermittently competent at containing it. Further east, the basin grows heavier with imperial memory, divine order, magical intrigue, and the legal delicacies of disputed waters. Papers are checked more sternly. Offerings are made more carefully. A crate must be opened in the presence of an official whose sense of ceremony outweighs his speed. A shrine clerk records the names of those sailing onward in case the sea later returns only rumor. A Thayan agent smiles too smoothly. A Mulhorandi functionary inspects seals as if the hierarchy of the cosmos depends upon twine. A priest from Unther argues theology with a sailor who has survived enough storms to prefer practical liturgy over doctrinal elegance. Somewhere offshore, beneath all of this, undersea eyes note the shadow of the hull and assign it meanings the crew will never hear. By the time our vessel returns west months later, it is no longer the same ship in any social sense. Its hold carries new goods. Its crew carries altered loyalties, debts, affections, grudges, infections, vocabularies, prayers, and opportunities. The captain knows which port to avoid next season, which customs official may be bribed only through his sister, which pirate anchorages are changing hands, which temple chapter is quietly buying influence, which merchant house is overextended, which coastal road has become unsafe because refugees are clustering there, which city is about to boast of peace while preparing for war, and which rumor about distant eastern riders is perhaps not rumor after all. That ship, my apprentice, is a moving chapter of history. Multiply her by thousands across generations, and you begin to understand the inner sea. This is why I called it Bloodstream, not because the metaphor is dramatic, because it is exact. Bloodstream carries nourishment, poison, alarm, memory of wounds, and the means by which one injury becomes everyone's concern. So too, the Sea of Fallen Stars. It circulated life and risk together. It allowed wealth to concentrate and dependence to spread. It made ports cosmopolitan and coastal politics twitchy. It turned local crises regional. It made piracy profitable, law necessary, hypocrisy sophisticated, and absolute isolation impossible. And once a basin has taught its peoples to live this way, later shocks strike differently. Remember that, for we are nearing the season's last quarter now, when events will begin to show more clearly how connected Faerûn had become. A sudden military eruption far to the east, a returning imperial nostalgia, a faction learning to operate across borders, a divine or magical upheaval. Such things do not fall upon isolated chessboards. They strike networks already under tension. The Sea of Fallen Stars is one of the great reasons that later Faerûn can react so quickly, fear so widely, and adapt with such uneven brilliance to shocks that would once have remained local. When hoofbeats begin to matter far beyond the horizon, when returning shades imagine themselves rightful heirs to the world, when factions discover that roads and ports make them sturdier than crowns, when gods later tumble into mortal consequence, you will understand more clearly because you have seen the basin through which so much of the news, the wealth, the fear, and the opportunity already moved. That is the true function of tonight's episode in our season. It is a convergence, not of chronology alone, but of logic. Roads taught us landward connection. Borderlands taught us contested identity. Kingdoms taught us institutions. The sea teaches circulation. And circulation is what makes history fast enough to hurt. So what should you carry away from the stacks tonight? Not merely that the sea of fallen stars is large, though it is. Not merely that pirates lurked there, navies patrolled it, merchants crossed it, or storms killed upon it, though all of that is true. The more important thing is this. The inner sea explains why so much of central and eastern Faerûn feels historically crowded. It is because the waters kept forcing contact. Coasts became neighbors whether they wished to be or not. Ideas did not remain provincial. Port wealth altered inland ambitions. States learned maritime habits and were altered by learning them. Peoples met, traded, lied, worshipped, intermarried, infected, escorted, exploited, rescued, and remembered across a shared basin that neither forgave carelessness nor permitted stillness for long. And so I leave you, as ever, with questions rather than soothing simplifications. What does a kingdom become when it can no longer pretend its troubles are local? What forms of law arise when traffic matters more than purity? How much of a people's character is shaped by the goods they must import, the routes they must defend, and the strangers they must tolerate because prosperity depends upon them? When does a port cease to belong primarily to its hinterland and begin instead to belong to the basin? What would you fear more as a ruler? An enemy army at the border, or a sea that can make your border irrelevant by moving wealth, rumor, and hunger around it? And what of memory? Is a wreck forgotten because it has sunk? Is a drowned shrine erased because fish pass through it? Is a treaty less real because the waves blur the line where it supposedly applies? Or does the sea preserve a harsher archive than land? One written not in stone walls, but in repeated routes, lost cargoes, inherited caution, old pilot lore, barnacled offerings, and the names of shoals whispered by mariners who never met the dead that named them. There is, I think, one last lesson here for the apprentice historian. Maps lie most persuasively in blue. They color the sea as emptiness, as though what matters must happen on the margins while the center exists only to separate them. Yet some of the most important spaces in history are not solid at all. They are mediums of transfer, rivers, roads, caravan routes, mountain passes, market seasons. And above all, in this case, an inland sea whose very restlessness gave shape to the civilizations around it. That is why I chose the sounding lead tonight. To read such a sea properly, one must ask what lies beneath apparent openness. What hidden flaw rises toward the keel? What silt of prior catastrophe? What wreckage of older ages? What undersea sovereignties? What legal fictions? What trade habits? What pirate coves? What temple debts? What convoy customs? What remembered storms? What quiet dependencies? The surface is only the invitation. History begins when you take the sounding. Next time we leave the quays and look east to another kind of motion. Not tide, not convoy, not the measured circulation of merchant basin and port law. Hoofbeats. We will turn to the Tweegan shock and to what happens when the settled powers of Faerûn confront a force they are tempted, fatally, to misunderstand as mere disorder, because it moves too quickly to resemble the forms they call civilized. If tonight has shown you how connected the world around the inner sea had become, next time you will see how such connected worlds react when step power crashes against them. Until then, the website is live at taleofthelich.com. Merch is coming soon, a phrase that continues to amuse me because nothing says archival solemnity quite like the prospect of one's reflections on maritime interdependence eventually appearing on objects designed for tea, ink, or unfortunate impulse purchases. Still, if some cup, shirt, or other wearable confession persuades a passerby to ask why the Sea of Fallen Stars mattered, I shall count commerce briefly redeemed. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions, for web design and development built to survive scale, shifting traffic, layered permissions, unexpected user behavior, interdependent systems, and the perennial mortal discovery that infrastructure matters most after everyone has grown bored of praising it. Visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If you require builders who understand that channels must remain clear, thresholds explicit, routes intelligible, and maintenance continuous, if a structure is to endure real use, choose those who have made peace with complexity rather than merely decorating it. Until then, keep your candles trimmed, your manifests honest whenever honesty is survivable, your harbor gossip separated from your final conclusions by at least one night's sleep, and your admiration for maps moderated by the knowledge that the blankest spaces upon them are often the busiest. I am Irillian Cantonine. This has been the Lich's Tale. And remember, ruin is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting begins when water is painted as emptiness. It begins when ports are treated as incidental to kingdoms that could not survive without them. It begins when we praise fleets and omit dockhands, admire merchants and omit pilots, record treaties and omit the cargoes that made them necessary, study coastlines and ignore the undersea peoples below, curse pirates without asking which respectable powers fed them, and speak of civilizations as though they were self-made, when in truth they were carried, provisioned, warned, enriched, and endangered by roots larger than themselves. Good night, my apprentice. May your records remain exact, your roots well-sounded, your thresholds watched, your comparisons unsentimental, and your sense of history broad enough to remember that the great engine in the middle of Faerûn was never a blank blue gap between the important things. It was one of the important things.